The deadline has passed for teams to pick up the fifth-year options for their 2020 first-round draft picks. Which options were picked up, which were declined, and what can we learn from those players, picks, and teams? Coming up on today's Peacock and Williamson.
NFL analyst Brian Peacock and former NFL scout Matt Williamson bring you expert NFL analysis every day in less than 30 minutes. Get an inside look into the NFL on the field and in the front office. With elite breakdowns, next-level analysis, and in-depth information only for the real NFL fans. This is Peacock and Williamson, and it starts now.
Welcome to the Peacock and Williamson NFL Show. Brian Peacock alongside Matt Williamson at BD Peacock at Williamson NFL. Thanks everybody for making us your first listen on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Tomorrow's Twitter Thursday episode. We're going to push it back to Thursday because we got to talk fifth-year options.
Yeah.
So, those questions, hit us up on Twitter at BD Peacock at Williamson NFL or drop it in the YouTube comments. So much to take from the fifth-year options that were picked up and the ones that were declined, Matt, from that 2020 draft class. And we're sort of taking a break here post-draft from grading the 2023 class. And, obviously we know those grades are too early, and we'll find out in a couple of years, likely by the time that those options are picked up for the fifth-year options for the 2023 class, what were hits, what were misses, and you can really start to grade those draft classes. And we're going to go back and look at some old classes, and we'll probably revisit 2020 draft later on this offseason, but it's pretty easy to tell right now how some of those picks are going already. And the most unbelievable part of all of it, Matt, I think when it comes to first round draft picks is just 2-3 short years later, Matt, these players are worth either everything or nothing. It's pretty amazing.
It's crazy. I mean, I think this is a really educational podcast in that you mentioned it. There was a Twitter question or suggestion. Hey, can you go back 3 years ago and analyze that draft and what you thought? Great. We will do that. But in the meantime, we kind of are going to do it today, 5 years ago. And
the teams are going to grade it for us. They're going to tell us what they think about their draft class.
Exactly. And this was considered a very strong draft class, much better than the one this past season. But I think that I don't want to ruin people's expectations for their new favorite draft picks that your team just drafted over the weekend, but it probably won't even go as well as this class we're about to analyze. And one thing you know what I mean?
It's funny because, fans get mad. They're like, well, why are you giving my team a bad grade? Let's wait and see. The grade is probably already too kind because everyone's
waiting to see is going to get ugly. Yeah.
There wasn't a lot of B draft classes in this draft.
No, 100%. And I mentioned this to you off the air, and this isn't revisionist history because I really, really felt this way about this specific draft. Was analyzing it. I thought there were 16 really good prospects. And of those 16, 15 of them went in the first 15 picks. And then Atlanta kind of shook us up and took A.J. Terrell because I thought C.D. Lamb, who went 17, was the 16th good guy. I thought there were 16 dudes and a teardrop. And I was wrong about A.J. Terrell, but there ended up being 17 in the teardrop because after that, it gets ugly. Well, let's get into each one because I think there's a lot to learn here.
Absolutely. Let's do it. And so for those
there's
of you
a formula too.
When it comes to the fifth-year options and those salaries that the players are going to make, it's by position group, and then it's also by 4 different tiers of salary. And so if you make multiple Pro Bowls in that time, you're going to be at the highest level of your position group for your fifth-year option. And, obviously those are the players they're automatically picked up. Everyone loves their player if they're making multiple Pro Bowls and you're trying to re-sign him with a long-term contract anyway. If you make 1 Pro Bowl, that's the second tier. Then there's a playing time tier for the third tier, the players that don't make a Pro Bowl, but their snap counts during those first 3 seasons were 75% or greater in 2 of their first 3 years. And then there's another tier of that playing time that is 50% or greater over all 3 of those seasons for playing time. And then there's the 4th one, which is basic, and you're a first-round pick, but you didn't hit any of those requirements, and you're at the lowest level of your position group as far as dollars for that fifth-year option.
Interesting. So, well, let's just go player by player because I think there's a lot to learn by all of them. Is that cool?
And it started at the top with Joe Burrow. It was the Joe Burrow draft. He went number 1, and they're trying to find a way to pay him $50 million a year now. Obviously, that extra, whatever option it was, is very cheap for what he's about to make.
So That's great. You know, I mean, that's the poster boy. That's how, you know, you want it to happen. You hit on your first overall pick. Hopefully the Panthers do the same with Young, you know, 5 years from now, that it's a slam dunk. But it's still $29.5 million you're giving Burrow. I mean, if he was, you know, like when we get to Tua, you have a conversation, or Daniel Jones a year ago, you know, like it's still not cheap because he has been successful, but it is cheap for Burrow. I mean, like you said, he might be 50, 60 million. You're getting him at a bargain. This is why the rule was created. That's a very team friendly, obvious pickup. Great.
And then that's where things went off the rails. So
exactly,
obviously
right.
Injury was a part of this one for Chase Young. He had a really good rookie season, had the knee injury, and has hardly played or done anything. I think it's a sack and a half since that first season for Chase Young, and they declined his 5th-year option.
So he's been the subject of trade rumors, and I frankly think anyone that wasn't picked up can be had for a pretty decent price. You know, I mean, I think you could get him, and then you could extend him if you want. Maybe you wait and see a month into the season or the trade deadline. So any of these not picked up guys, I think, are somebody that could be attained. And just looking at the numbers, he's a little higher than some of the others. I assume he made a Pro Bowl as a rookie, which must bump it up to 17.5. But I'm still shocked. I mean, like none of us would have said after the first round 5 years ago, oh, I mean, Chase Young's probably the safest bet of anyone to get picked up for the 5th-year option.
Right. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
You know what I mean? And I think Washington's probably on the fence.
Perfect example of guys who could be had. Jeffrey Okudah, number 3 pick in the draft, been traded. It was for a 5th-round pick, too. And since he was traded, he was ineligible to have that 5th-year option picked up. So automatically, I don't think it would have got picked up anyway, because it would have been fairly high, even though he wouldn't have met, you know, some of those playing time and some of those Pro Bowl standards. It wasn't going to be the hugest number, but, you know, probably doubtful you're going to pick a guy up anyway. They're just trying to reclaim his career, hopefully, for the Atlanta Falcons.
So there's 32 of these, of course. You know, that year had 32, not 31, of course. And there's 2 players that are, quote, not eligible. And just because you got traded doesn't mean you're not eligible. But if they add to your contract in any way, it voids it. And I think the Falcons gave him a little chunk of money, so he can't be picked up. But there's no chance he would have. That's why they traded him. And Jordan Love, who we'll get to, also is not eligible. I assume they would pick him up, but who knows? They kind of split the difference on that.
Yeah, they split the difference. I don't know if that was because they told him they were going to, and we hadn't really talked about that yet with, you know, they sort of hedged, and both sides were like, well, look, let's just, you know, restructure the deal. We have a 2-year contract now, essentially, and we're spreading that money over 2 years instead. So it worked out for the team and the player, especially if they, you know, weren't able to pick up the 5th-year option because they don't know enough about him yet.
So do you agree on the Wednesday after the draft 5 years ago, like Chase Young, I would have put a buck down that Okudah was going to get his 5th-year option picked up by the Lions?
Yeah, 3 years ago.
5 years ago. 4 years ago.
2020. Yeah, so they've played 3 seasons.
Okay, yeah, okay. Right. Right. Makes sense. Because we're a year ahead.
And then, yeah, so the 5th-year option is not for this coming year, it's for the next year after.
Right. But he seems super safe too. Right.
You're not even picking it up for this coming year because you're projecting another year after that for these guys. So you're picking up, it's an early time to decline or exercise that option. So that makes it even tougher for teams. If you haven't seen it, how are you going to lock yourself into $17 million?
Right. I mean, like Seahawk fans, I'm sure 99% of you out there are like, oh, we'll pick up Witherspoon's 5th-year option. Well, Okudah was a better prospect than Witherspoon.
And Andrew Thomas, pick number 4, New York Giants. That 5th-year option was exercised, started slow, finished stronger. That's another thing. If you want to have a good year, make your 3rd year the good year, not your rookie year.
Yeah, after his rookie year, I don't think any Giants fans were like, oh, we'll be picking up that 5th-year option, no doubt. But he's a great player now.
Tua's 5th-year option exercised by the Miami Dolphins, the number 5 pick, and the number 6 pick, Justin Herbert, quarterback for the Chargers. His 5th-year option, obviously, very easy decision there to have that 5th-year option exercised.
And like Burrow, Herbert's $29 million. Tua's only $23. I assume he hasn't made a Pro Bowl. Would you have hesitated on Tua? I mean, it's still a bargain for $23 million.
I might have hesitated, but also it wouldn't have. I would have done it. That's the right choice.
I mean, he's good when he's out there.
Number 7 pick in the draft that year, Derek Brown, defensive tackle, to the Carolina Panthers. They did pick up his fifth-year option. And then the 8th pick, Isaiah Simmons, linebacker. Is he a linebacker? We still don't know, which is probably part of the reason why the Cardinals did not pick up his fifth-year option.
Along with Chase Young, that's a guy I might be targeting if I'm a team out there, because you can just look at him and be like, they've kind of ruined this kid and haven't used him right from the beginning. Maybe I can do something different with Isaiah Simmons.
I mean, the Steve Keim era with those defensive picks, we saw it with Hassan Reddick. They used him wrong. Like, pick a guy and use him correctly. First of all, you draft an edge guy, put him at off-ball linebacker. I know he's shaped and, shape and speed and all this factor in, but play him at their best position. Isaiah Simmons is a weird one where it's like, man, he's kind of a safety in a linebacker's body.
Yeah, right. He's their slot guy last year too.
And he played a little better. So if you're watching that, you're like, okay, do we believe in this size? And we're going to play him at maybe strong safety instead.
Can he match up against the Kelseys of the world? Maybe he can do that. Or I don't know. Some of these dudes come out and, he's a linebacker, but he plays corner and he can play free. He might not be any. Some of those, you kind of have to have a bread and butter. I mean, positionless football is great, but that doesn't mean I want him guarding Wes Welker for 30 snaps.
Right. All right. So some more thoughts when it comes to linebackers there with Simmons, more thoughts with a ton of other players in this class that options were not picked up when we go through the rest of the first round from the 2020 draft and those fifth-year options next. Today's episode of Peacock and Williamson is brought to you by FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. Make a fast break to FanDuel right now during the NBA playoffs because new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's $1,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. There's no better place to bet all the playoff action than America's #1 sports book. It's not just NBA either. We got NHL playoffs. We got Major League Baseball all summer long. Those draft props were so fun. There's still NFL futures to bet on as well. Future Super Bowl winners, future MVPs. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. So here's an interesting one, and multiple players are already on other teams, and it's pretty amazing because, the euphoria of having an NFL draft, and then you are one short year away from that draft class, and the guy you drafted is already getting traded, which is what happened to C.J. Henderson. The Jaguars originally drafted C.J. Henderson, and they had to go to his house and wake him up and were like, dude, are you going to come to practice or what? And so they just shipped him off to Carolina. And, he had all the talent in the world to be a pretty locked down man-to-man cornerback. Yeah. But if the guy doesn't want to be that, then they're not going to be that. And so, obviously that's an easy decline there for a guy who didn't even get into his second season, let alone his second contract with the team that drafted him.
Yeah, I think they shipped him out for a third-round pick a year after they drafted him. I mean, so really drove the car off the lot, lost it, sold it for pennies. But he's a good example because kind of like the Okudah conversation, he got traded, but the Panthers didn't do anything to his contract. So they had the option of whether they pick it up or not. Easy decision. But, your favorite team, and I'm not picking on Jalen Carter, but he has off the field issues, motivation issues. Does he love football? A lot of us just brush that off after our favorite team picked the dude. We'll coach it out of him. Well, not always happens.
And C.J. Henderson went in that same 9th slot that Jalen Carter did this year.
I mean, he was a really good prospect on tape and combine and all that stuff.
Jedrick Wills, offensive tackle for the Cleveland Browns. His option was picked up by the Browns, the 10th pick in that draft. Mekhi Becton, offensive tackle, went a run on offensive tackles in that class, 10 through 13. Pick 11, Mekhi Becton's had some, weight issues, injury issues. His option was declined. I did see a photo of him recently, though, and he looked like he was in great shape. So we'll see.
Really?
A lot of players show up, quote unquote, best shape of their lives a lot, and sometimes it matters, sometimes it doesn't. But if he can stay on the field, I mean, he's kind of a freaky dude, and so I think injury is the real big thing with Mekhi Becton. And so if he's in shape and he's healthy, we'll see if he has that resurgent year. But he'll be a free agent if so.
Obviously, career crossroads time for Mekhi Becton.
Yes.
And this was a really good tackle class because even next up here is Tristan Wirfs. I mean, Wills, I think, was a questionable decision, but you probably lean towards $14 million for a starting left tackle. I'm sure the Jets didn't hesitate to say no, and certainly the Giants and Bucks ran to the podium type of thing to pick up the fifth-year option on their guys. So I think all four of these guys were better prospects than Paris Johnson or Jones in this upcoming class, or Wright. You know, I think they all would have been the first one.
Wirfs was an interesting one. Wirfs was kind of like the Broderick Jones, where it was like, yeah, kind of raw. But he is, you know, the talent, the physical talent's crazy. So if he puts it together, and he put it together immediately, people are thinking maybe he's even a guard, because I don't know if he's a tackle. He's better at right tackle than left tackle kind of thing. Trade up one spot to 13, draft Tristan Wirfs, and he's been a superstar right tackle. Might end up being left tackle at some point, but easy pick up there for the option of Tristan Wirfs by the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Javon Kinlaw, this was an easy decline for the 49ers. Yeah, he's been, you know, he was sort of a super raw, powerful player, the first guy off the bus type of guy. He's just so big and menacing. Has never really developed his game. He doesn't have a lot of skill developed to go with his raw power and tools and size. And then he had injuries coming into the league too, which is, you know, there was medical red flags. Some teams took him off their board. Niners drafted him. They gambled on it, and that gamble was a loss, because I just don't know if he's going to have much of a career, because he's constantly, you know, hurt. He's got arthritic knees at the age of 24.
Yeah, and everyone thought raw, but his flashes are great. And correct me if I'm wrong, I'm almost certain this was the immediate response to trading DeForest Buckner, right?
It was the pick they got from trading DeForest Buckner, and immediately went back to defensive tackle with it too.
Makes sense. And I don't know if they told themselves we have to get his replacement and mistake was made that way, or hey, just bad luck, you know.
Multiple mistakes there, in my opinion.
Yeah,
ignoring the red flags and trying to replace a guy when you had Eric Armstead, who should have just moved right side your tackle, and he ended up being the tackle anyway. But they wanted to keep him outside, draft the tackle to replace him. Mistakes were made. Jerry Jeudy was the 15th pick, and his option was picked up. I think Jerry Jeudy was one of the few in this class where it's like, I could kind of see it both ways. But wide receiver is so valuable. We've seen some good play from him, maybe a little disappointing, but it wasn't so much the black and white like with some other prospects where it's like, oh, it's either he's worth everything or worth nothing. Judy's kind of in the middle zone, one of the few.
Exactly. I mean, receivers, you can make this argument. If Jerry Jeudy was a free agent, he'd probably get more than $13 million that he's getting for this year. But has he ever been worth $13 million at any stage of his career? Probably not, but he's an expensive position. And I guess this is a, pat on the butt. Good job, Jerry. But then they go draft Marvin Mims, so it's not exactly a ringing endorsement.
As you mentioned earlier, A. Terrell was that 16th pick in the draft, the Atlanta Falcons, and he's been really good for them. That option was picked up. CeeDee Lamb, the 17th pick by the Cowboys. His option was picked up for year 5. Then Austin Jackson, the 18th pick.
Now it gets ugly. Like, we weren't wrong saying there was a line of demarcation in this draft, because it gets ugly.
It was a big drop, and we kind of didn't feel good about that pick when it happened for the Miami Dolphins when they took Austin Jackson. Pretty athletic tackle, but it was like, oh man, feels like you're kind of forcing that one in there because you need an offensive lineman, and they have declined the option on Jackson. He's kind of played right side, left side, and just never really lived up to what they hoped they could develop his athleticism into. The 20th pick in the class was
real quick on Jackson, just because you mentioned your team. This was the Minkah trade. The Dolphins made this pick when the Steelers sent them Minkah, or the other way around. And you'd rather have Minkah.
Absolutely rather have Minkah.
Right,
Don't overvalue your draft. Like, draft picks are important, and you need to develop young talent for your team, but don't overvalue draft picks either. Like, if you can fit the salary structure in, you get a young star player, and you're going to hit with it. Probably worth making that trade in a lot of cases.
Yep. So real quick on the Minkah trade. I mean, again, I think it's just another example of taking the bird in the hand. When the Steelers made that trade, that was shortly after Roethlisberger was lost for the season. That ended up being the Duck Hodges year. And this town went crazy. Like, we're going to pick first in the draft, and you're trading it for Minkah Fitzpatrick. And I even looked around on the air, and I'm like, there's some really, really bad teams in this league that the Steelers aren't going to lose more games than. And they ended up, right in the middle of the pack. And you get a safety that was coming off. You had a lot of NFL tape to go off of. You knew what you were getting in that guy.
Caleb Chasen, another tweenery player. It was athletic, but never really found a home, never really found a position in the NFL for the Jacksonville Jaguars. His 5th-year option was declined. Jalen Reagor didn't last long. He's bounced around the league already. I think he's on his 3rd team now, right? Is Jalen Reagor? Maybe his 2nd team.
I think they traded him to Vikings for nothing.
Yeah. Okay. So he's still in Minnesota. But
he may not even make the team, though. you know.
That option was declined, and which hurts even more for obviously the Philadelphia Eagles turned out okay, and they ended up drafting and trading for other wide receivers. But man, they chose poorly when they went Rager over Justin Jefferson, who's the 22nd pick by those Minnesota Vikings, and obviously they exercised that 5th-year option and are going to sign him to a very large contract very soon.
Right, and Jefferson's one of the few home runs of this neighborhood, obviously, and as you kind of mentioned, I mean, Rager's going to kind of be historically known as the mistake the Eagles made instead of Jefferson, because a lot of people had Jefferson ranked ahead of him.
And speaking of trading veterans, that was Jefferson was the pick that they traded away.
Oh, yeah, Diggs.
Stephon Diggs for.
Okay, and that worked out for everybody.
Kenneth Murray, linebacker, Los Angeles Chargers, did not exercise his 5th-year option. More on off-ball linebackers in a second, and more on interior offensive linemen in a second, too, because the 24th pick, New Orleans Saints, did not pick up the option for Cesar Ruiz, who's been a starting player for them.
Yeah, I bet that was somewhat of a conversation, but he would have been just over $14 million. I bet you could use that money elsewhere, and they're also like the most cash-strapped team in the league.
So just pausing right here on that section, because off-ball linebackers, and we talked about the not liking the Jack Campbell pick for the Detroit Lions. And it's pretty telling that looking at 5th-year option rates for the last 3 drafts, or the last 3 cycles of 5th-year options. So the 2018 draft class, 2019 draft class, 2020 draft class. Of interior offensive linemen, there haven't been a ton of picks, but there have been 6 interior offensive linemen in those 3 drafts, and only half of them, the options have been picked up. And you look at Cesar Ruiz, he's been a good player, he's been a starter, but offensive linemen are lumped into one category. It's not separated from tackle to guard and center or whatever. So all these big offensive tackle contracts are raising up that 5th-year option money. So I don't know if it helps you to draft a interior offensive lineman in the 1st round because you get the 5th-year option. I don't think it helps you in a lot of cases.
So, yeah, I mean, to pay Ruiz the same money you're paying Andrew Thomas and Wirfs,
right?
Of course you're not going to pay him, but that's not really his fault. He played fine. He's a starter. You know, if this was, I don't know, 10 million instead of 14, maybe the Saints pick it up.
And then looking at
there's also 2 off-the-ball linebackers coming up that also weren't picked up. So, like,
right.
Awful.
Let's go through that first before I bring up the rest of it then, because, that's it's pretty telling there. Brandon Ayuk, 25th pick in the draft. That option was picked up by the San Francisco 49ers. That was a pretty easy, two easy decisions for the 49ers with their 2 first-round picks that year. Jordan Love, they agreed on a contract through the next 2 years. The extension's worth $22.5 million. $13.5 million guaranteed. So they kind of both team and player hedged on the 5th-year option there, and he gets a little bit more money early instead of waiting on the 5th-year option money, and they get a couple more years to figure that out with Jordan Love in Green Bay. Jordan Brooks had some flashes, had some good times, but they still declined the option for Jordan Brooks' 5th year with the Seattle Seahawks for the 27th pick in that draft. Patrick Queen, it was pretty clear that they were going to decline the option there, were the Baltimore Ravens. Then you got the last 2 picks here, which were Noah Igbenogany, who hasn't done really anything for the Miami Dolphins. No. That option declined, and pick 32, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, easy decline there for the Kansas City Chiefs, who should never have drafted a running back in the 1st round.
I always make the joke that I think Andy Reid used to go out to practice and look at Clyde Edwards-Helaire and say, I wish you were Jonathan Taylor. Like, because that was a pretty good running back class, and they all went in the 2nd round. You know, Dobbins,
right. And what's funny is he probably doesn't ask. He probably doesn't ask, because that was coming off a Super Bowl, right? So they're riding high, and the story goes that he asked Patrick Mahomes which running back he liked. I don't know if that's the best way to scout the draft.
You're not.
Putting all this work is like, let's see. The quarterback's like, oh, this guy looks fun. Let's draft him. And like, let's not.
Again, running backs are not a great investment, but just imagine a world where that was Jonathan Taylor, not Clyde Edwards-Helaire. You know, like, and it's only $5.4 million. It's way less than anybody else, and they still didn't pick it up.
The most basic level, the lowest level, and running back. So it's not even a big option. They still didn't pick it up.
That's one thing. Like, I talk about this with Najee Harris a lot, who isn't great. But the 5th-year option for a running back that isn't great isn't that backbreaking. It's probably going to be like $6 or $7 million for Najee. So
right, and it'll be higher because he'll hit those. He'll hit playtime and He'll hit playtime
Yeah.
stuff that Clyde Edwards-Helaire didn't. But, and who knows if he makes a Pro Bowl, then, might jump it up a little bit more. But
A
it's
little
not gonna
bit.
be $10 million
20
would be the maximum.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Next. So some big ideas and what positions are being picked up and what we can learn about NFL drafts. And I want to point to Brad Holmes and the Detroit Lions here one more time, because he had an interesting quote yesterday about not this, but I think it ties into all this as well, coming up next. Thanks, everybody, for making Peacock and Williamson your first listen every day. Shout out to all the everydayers. Tomorrow, we've got the mailbag coming up, our Twitter Thursday. And I don't know, Wednesdays, Thursdays, Tuesdays, midweek, we're always going to do a mailbag here. We might start doing a lot of live shows as well. And so get some of you hanging out with us live on YouTube, which is a lot of fun to do the Q&A and the mailbag that way. But tune in. Let us know on Twitter what your questions are at BD Peacock, at Williamson NFL, or drop them in the YouTube comments. Okay, so looking at options, we talked about the interior offensive linemen. Only about half of them are getting picked up over the last 3 drafts. Over the last 3,
that rule might be changed.
I think you do. I think you do have to change that. It just doesn't really make a lot of sense for the economics of the game, really.
Mm-hmm.
But here's even more telling position groups here. Of those same 3 draft classes, 2018 through 2020, only 1 of 5 running back 5th-year options was picked up. And off-ball linebackers, 10 were drafted. Only 3 of those were picked up. And those were the 2 positions that the Lions drafted this year, right?
Yeah, right.
And we talked about, not premier positions. And
Jahmyr Gibbs is going to be different. Campbell's going to be different. Are you sure?
You think they're easy to project? You think it's
right.
always going to work out? Doesn't always work out that way. In fact, it usually does not work out that way. And I want to go to a quote from Brad Holmes. And he was talking about how, some people were maybe, not grading his draft well or whatever. And he said, quote, "You got to battle the whole thing of people having minimal information versus people having all the information, which is us."
I get it.
And my response to that is, well, what about that information? Like, I know you have a lot of medical and you have a lot of information on the actual prospects, but why is the hit rate so low then? Since you have all this information.
Right.
Why are teams not drafting better than consensus draft boards by analysts who don't have all the inside information or just looking at tape? And you have the information that tells you don't draft linebackers, don't draft running backs, yet you still did it. In fact, you drafted both of those positions in the first round. So,
yeah,
Brad, you got a lot of information. Are you looking at the right information? Is it analysis paralysis by teams? That would be my response to Brad Holmes there.
And I understand the point, because I still agree that NFL teams know more than me and you and Dane
Absolutely.
and Mel, and of course. But, I mean, and the other thing, you mentioned the medical and all that. They spent the whole day with the dude. They talked to him. I've never met Jahmyr Gibbs. I never will. He may be the salt of the earth, and I love him so much. And sitting down with him makes me say, I have to bring him in my room. Well, maybe you cloud your judgment then. You know what I mean? Like, you're making it personal, or, I don't know. So, I spin things back to the Steelers. You spin things back to the Niners. You look at the Steelers draft. Everyone they took was like way above the common board, and things broke their way. But it's a new GM, and I'm not making fun of Omar Khan in any way. I know him a little bit. He's a good dude, and I think he's really good at his job. But let's say I'm a new GM, what if I just took the approach of, I'm going to pull up Mel's board or DJ's board and just pick the best guy, and everyone in the media will say how smart I am. And whether they hit or not, I can blame the coaching staff that they screwed it up. I picked all the right guys. You screwed it up.
Oh, no doubt. Yeah.
You can do that.
We see it every offseason. You can win the draft, and it's not actually a win when we look back in 3 years, as we're doing right now. You could do it in free agency as well. You can spend a bunch of money, and everyone's like, hey, they won the offseason. How often does the team that wins the offseason win in the regular season and in the playoffs? Mm-hmm. It doesn't happen that often. I think the Eagles are probably the closest thing to it last year, right? They had a pretty good offseason. But the Chargers had a great offseason last year, right? And still haven't gotten over that hump. So, it is funny, and it's drafting is hard. And teams have the most information. Why aren't they better is my question, because I would put very smart analysts that watch tape and do the work. I would put them up against actual teams that have all the information and more information. And I don't think the teams would now draft them. And we've seen that. And we're seeing it right now in this episode with these 5th-year options. Yep. So what are you doing with the extra information? It's not helping them.
Right. You're dead on. And the money they spent and the time and the resources, I'm not saying it's all for nothing. It is helpful to know more than Dane or me or you or whoever. But I know for a fact that Dane or Todd or DJ or whoever could easily be a scout for a team and maybe a GM. You know, I mean, these guys are good.
And the other thing I'll say to that too is, what information are you looking at? Are you utilizing it? And Brad Holmes, there's maybe some information you need to look at with off-ball linebackers and running backs, because even when you hit, you don't hit in some cases. And we've seen it with running backs. I mean, like Clyde Edwards-Helaire, obviously not picked up. He had no factor in them. If he never existed on their team, they still win Super Bowls. A 7th-round rookie was their leading rusher in that Super Bowl, right? And then you look at Christian McCaffrey. You look at Saquon Barkley. Like, they didn't miss. Those were talented running backs. But those teams didn't win with those guys. Like, you didn't go win because you had this great running back. So even if you hit and you're the Detroit Lions, does it really help you? And you're probably not picking up the 5th-year option. And so, yeah.
There's a lot to learn from this stuff. Yeah.
Information is in the eye of the beholder, I guess.
I don't know if you have any more, but I mean, just to sum it up, I wanted to say this as soon as we finish the 32nd pick. 32 picks in the first round, 12 were picked up, plus Love. So I'm going to call that 12.5. I think Love was just splitting the difference.
Yes.
And then in the final 12 picks, which were the playoff teams at that point, I mean, that's 20 and beyond, 2 were picked up, Jefferson, Ayuk, and Love. So 2.5 of the last 12 were picked up, and 12.5 total of the 32. Nobody sees that coming.
And it bucks the idea, because remember, every draft we talk about, it doesn't really happen. I think the Tennessee Titans actually were trying to do it this year, but it almost never happens, because we always say, maybe the team's going to jump into the end of the first round so you get that 5th-year option. If you're drafted a 2nd-round guy at the end of the first round, you're probably not going to pick up the option anyway. But
right. They always say for a quarterback, that's a great idea. You know, for Levis, they should have got the 32. Well, Hurts was also in this class, and they extended him already. You know what I mean? Like, he was a 2nd-rounder.
Yeah. It is unbelievable. Even if you add in the like Cesar Ruiz and some of the other players that were maybe not complete misses that teams are starting, or they like their players, they're still batting less than 500. Like, half of the players that went in that first round were, busts compared to what they thought they were going to be getting with those draft picks. And
this was a very good draft class then and now. I mean, Burrow, Herbert, Tua, Hurts. I mean, there's star left tackles on this list. This is a better class than the one that just happened.
Really fun. I love going through these types of exercises and seeing and learning from past drafts. How can you improve your process? And, I wonder what Brad Holmes is doing right now with this information and looking at this process and how it might affect future drafts for the Detroit Lions and for every team in the NFL.
Interesting stuff. You learn a lot.
Yep, absolutely. All right. Thanks, everybody, for making Peacock and Williamson your first listen. Tomorrow, mailbag time at BD Peacock at Williamson NFL. Talk to you then right here, Peacock and Williamson.